What do we find at the intersection of faith and the world? Our new podcast, Crossroads, explores this question in thought-provoking conversations featuring guests from around the world who are seeking to live faithfully in the public square. This is a safe space to discuss politics, technology, and our responsibilities as citizens. Pull up a chair and meet us as we search for a better way forward. Welcome to Crossroads, where we discuss the intersection of sacred and civic. I'm your host, Jo Nygaard Owens, and today we're joined by Dr. Kate Ott, professor of Christian ethics at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary and author of Christian Ethics for a Digital Society. As the title of her book suggests, we'll be digging into the intersection of ethics and digital life. Hi, Kate. It's so good to have you with us. And tell us, where are you joining from?
Thanks for having me. And I am joining from Evanston, Illinois, northern Chicagoland area.
Excellent. Also taking part in this conversation is the Reverend Leonard Hamlin, Canon Missioner at the Cathedral. Hi, Leonard, and where are you joining us from?
It's a pleasure to be with everyone this morning, and I'm joining right from the Washington National Cathedral.
Excellent. And I am actually in DC today. I flew in this morning for a quick visit, so it's fun to be recording from the cathedral again. So, Leonard, it was actually a conversation between you and Sonia that led us down the path of AI and digital life. What prompted that conversation about generative AI and the church's response?
Well, I'm always appreciative to have conversations with Sonia in regards to the life that we're seeking to live through our faith and what impacts our living and our choices and decisions that we make. And so she was a wonderful resource to, as I would say, pick her brain on understanding these influences more and how they shape our life and what effect it would have. Being conscious of this certainly is what we all need to be aware of when we're operating and seeking to live out our faith.
Yeah, and that's what led us to dive down this road. And we've had 2 episodes already around AI and digital life. And so we're thrilled to be here with Kate because your book on Christian ethics offers a framework of how to think intentionally and creatively about our digital lives. You provide a framework rather than a prescription for how to think about it because of the ever-changing nature of digital life. It's even been 5 years since you published the book. And as I was reading it recently, I think it holds up totally. I think Leonard would agree as he was reading as well. But how do you feel like your framework resonates or applies in today's world, increasingly shaped by the advent and proliferation of AI?
Well, I'm glad to hear that it still holds up. I think that is because of the approach of the framework. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting if you actually look in the appendix of the book, I don't even think AI is listed in the appendix. And it's not because I wasn't talking about aspects of AI in terms of algorithms or the network nature, the flow of information. Clearly, AI was sort of the background development that was coming with each of those things. So one of the reasons I felt like a value-based framework would be so much more helpful in the face of how we would ethically approach digital technology was because even in writing the book, as soon as I would sort of think I had a grasp on something, it would change. It would develop. Something new would come out. So I really relied on sort of a combination between how we think about moral formation and moral discernment as all of us grow and develop, even from children through to adulthood. And so that framework, in addition to values, is really what I try to help the reader think through as they encounter different types of digital technology. So there's sort of 3 primary components to the framework. The first being this value-based approach, right? That we have to spend time as Christians in community thinking through what are our core values and how do we bring those values to all of the ethical challenges that we face each day. And the how of how we bring those values, we could think more about like art or improv or play as we think about moral formation, as opposed to, I've got a value, I'm going to apply it like mathematics. It doesn't work that way. It's sort of a give and take. And so that's the other piece of it, that once we see that we have some core values and we want to bring them into our conversations around digital discernment, that when we bring those, that enhances our own agency and options. It doesn't sort of say, oh, the tech's going to do what it's going to do, and I just throw my hands up. But no, we have agency in this, and working out of our values is the primary place that we bring agency and relationship to our engagement with technology. But that also means then third, that we've got to know something about digital technology, right? If this is an encounter, we really need to work hard at our digital literacy. And I think that's where, when I have, most of my conversations are with young folks, young adults, and people always say, oh, they're just so tech savvy. Some of them are, but most of them are actually, they're just digitally immersed. Right? They're not really tech savvy because the stuff works really well around them. And so I want all of us, young, old, to ask questions about how the technology works, increase our digital literacy so that when we do bring our values to it, when we have that encounter, when we discern and use our agency, we're really well informed about how we're making that engagement happen.
Do our churches need to be offering digital literacy classes?
Leonard, I don't know what you think about that, but my answer is a hearty yes.
Well, I'm going to agree with you, Kate. And let me say first, I know your book holds up very well. I sat down to open, of course, the reading of your material, and I did it almost as a task, but then it turned into a pleasure to get through, and it caused me to question and wrestle. But that's what we need to bring into the congregation. Is there, as we would often say in the journey of our faith, are we helping individuals to be seekers rather than just receivers? And I think what you are doing in your publication is engaging the conversation and the reader to be able to seek even beyond what's written on the page. And that would help them, of course, in the process. There's not enough conversation that takes place, I believe, often in our congregation settings, that when they walk in the door, I sometimes in my years have said that they ought not step into a time machine that takes them back 40 years and then sends them back into what would be the future and with the struggles that are there. So how are we engaging people, not only with where their feet are planted in the present moment, but helping them to have vision for what is to come in the future?
So that is so helpful to think about for me, of the not step into a time machine, that our world is constantly changing. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of young people are leaving our churches because they think that it is not keeping up, that it is not helping them discern what should be happening in everyday life. And obviously there's some questions about engagement with community and things like that, but just the core values that we are talking about, I believe they really do help us with this digital future. And so I think I might add a bit of an amendment. I do want to cultivate some spaces for all of us where we do step into an analog past every once in a while. Like, I think the ability to come into a sacramental context and just let go of the immense amount of information and constant connection that we have to have for a deeper form of connection. There's this whole movement about deep work. I feel like we need some deep spirituality to go along with that. And that's where I was trying in the book to pull from some of our really ancient, aware, meditative even types of spirituality. So when I talk about expanding difference, for example, as we engage the ways in which algorithms shape what we see and don't see and who we see and don't see online, right? I'm relating that back to Pentecost, to the Tower of Babel, right? These are ancient texts that tell us about how communities live life together. And yet they have significant meaning for this digital space. And I want us in churches to be able to create that bridge, because I really do think that things like concepts like metanoia, like the transformation that is required of self and community away from sin, from my point of view, those are the only things that are really going to get us to full engagement. The kind of 1 week digital retreat and things like that, they're not getting us there. Those are just task-based approaches.
Speaking of metanoia, one of the things that the Cathedral offers is online rite of reconciliation for Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. And we have a much greater response online than we do in person. People can choose to have their cameras on or off, and it's really beautiful, holy moment that happens because of our technology. And it enables the metanoia, the change, and this communal response because people are joining us from all over the country and world to participate. All right, so Episcopalians like to talk about the via media, or the middle way. So for those of you who don't know, at its founding, the Anglican Church was the middle way between Catholicism and Puritanism. And so how do we find the middle way in viewing our technology so that we don't view them with crippling fear or worshipful awe? What does that middle ground look like, and what do we need to get there?
Yeah, as I started on this work around digital ethics, and it still continues today, and we, I would guess, even if we just had an informal conversation, would tip the scales one direction or the other, right? When OpenAI released ChatGPT, I can't tell you how many people said to me, it's like magic. Like, this is amazing. It is. It feels that way. But if we approach it that way, we are potentially giving away all of our agency, our moral agency to engage it. We are acting as though it is this completely separate, external, literally magical thing we cannot understand or control. Now, there are aspects, especially of thinking about kind of general generative AI, that is a little black box. We don't necessarily know all the stuff that's going on there. But we should still be striving to understand how that engagement is happening. That also, I've heard some people say who haven't engaged OpenAI say things like, it's not that big of a deal, right? Like it can just write stuff. My father was one of those individuals. And so I said, have you ever tried it? So we pulled it up, and he was a lawyer. So he said, okay, I'm going to ask it a question like that I would have asked a clerk to go do for me. And literally in 10 seconds, it gave him all of the court case research that he would have needed a clerk to go do in the past. And so when we think of it only as a tool totally under our control, we assume we have a lot more agency than we do. When we think of it in worshipful awe as magic, we give away our agency to engage and think about the development and design of it. So I want us to be in the middle ground. I want us to recognize the co-constitutive nature of technology and of human agency, right? We humans are designing, developing technology. We are the users of it, but we are also shaped by it, and we are shaping it. And so what happens if we shift to thinking about that co-constitutive nature, that middle ground, middle way, that allows us to have a sense of agency in how we are engaging, and also to recognize that we don't have total full control over what's being designed and developed.
Kate, I think that was one of the pleasing aspects of reading your book, to look at how we're engaging. And as we talk about middle way, I'm often referring to that space as that space of tension. How do we do ministry in that space? Because that's really where ministry happens, not just on the extremes and the episodic moments, but how do we live within that place of tension, bringing both ends together? Because as we know, with this kind of generative AI and all that's coming, there are many, just like they would at an amusement park, they would be willing to get on that roller coaster and ride it, and they're screaming and just enjoying the unknown aspects of taking risk. But then there are those who would not even get online because they say, I'm not going anywhere near. They don't want anybody to drag them on or get on even by accident. But we have a wonderful opportunity here that's what I really enjoyed hearing about. How do we bring the two together and how do we navigate that place of tension? And also, as you said, with that agency, asking ourselves the question, what do we bring to this rather than just what we receive from this? And we do bring something to this effort and to this season of life that we find ourselves in.
Okay, I want to ask both of you one of Kate's framing questions. What does God require each of us to be and act in a way that promotes Christian values in all that we do, including the digital technologies we develop and use? It's a big one.
Why don't you go first, Leonard? Because I took a whole book to answer that question, so then I can just be shorter after that.
Well, hopefully it won't take me a whole book just in talking to answer that question. But I do think that we could go on with this conversation when we ask that pointed question, what's required from us? What are we bringing into this space? I really will ground this, as I think, succinctly in the great statement, of course, that we have from Jesus that says they hang on two main points: to love God and love our neighbor. And when we're looking at what's required of us, even in this space, do our actions, do our thoughts help us to do that? Does it take us down that road to where we can be in relationship with each other, where we are moving us toward a more just, as we would say, society and community, where we're caring for one another, the compassion? As you can see, all of these fall under different topics that we could discuss really individually in a different conversation, one after the other. But when we come to this wrestle with new technology, we do have to have these communal conversations as well as individual reflection that help us to be able to see if we're moving in that direction. And I think as we are engaging the uniqueness of different moments and circumstances, the questions and the answers will be unique to that moment.
Thanks, Leonard.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. And I mean, in most of my work, whether it's sexuality or technology related, the love commandment for me is always essential. Like, hey, we could actually discern most of our moral decisions if we just put that framework into action. So it makes me think about also even a wider understanding of how we make sure that it's not just love of God, but God's presence that's with us in all that we do related to technology. Cutter Calloway is a theologian that, maybe on a different theological end of the spectrum than I am, but we share an understanding of how we might think about God's presence through digital technology. And he even talks about the questions of like, okay, if where two or three are gathered, God is there, then is that true also in virtual reality? Right? Is that true in FaceTime, in a Teams meeting? Right? And so I don't think the technology is limiting where God's showing up. I think God's everywhere. And so how do we find ways to remind ourselves of that? I think that's work that we as human users need to be doing. I also think we need to think about the ways in which our use affects others. So thinking about the ways in which, oftentimes the Google search engine has been called a confessional in even in secular writings because of the perceived privacy. Well, we all know that's not actually true now, the perceived privacy. But our searches shift the way that the whole system works. It feeds on that energy, on that information, the same way social media feeds on certain popularity algorithms. Right? We might think we're just being affected as opposed to we are participating, but we are always participating, even in small ways. And so when folks are using different general AI, whether it's image generators, language generators, what we put in is shaping the overall system. And so how we participate makes a huge difference. Joy, I apologize if I pronounce her last name incorrectly, Balamwini, a Harvard grad, done amazing work on algorithmic bias, and also now moving into a lot of the bias that happens in various forms of AI. Her Algorithmic Justice League, if people want to check it out, it's really cool. You can report bias. Bias happens all the time, especially around gender, race, disability, sexuality, as we think about the ways technologies recognize us. It happens in formats of language. I mean, we have whole church traditions wrestling with inclusive language and gendered language. It's happening online all the time. Early on, when some of the generative AI models from OpenAI were coming out, I had a former student and I have a conversation, and he is a 1.5 gen Korean American. And he said, I'm not sure I should say this to everybody, but it just sounds like my smart white friend. And that's true because it is modeled around a predominant type of English language. Right. So there are folks like Philip Butler at ILIF Seminary who he's trying to develop an entire generative AI only sourcing from Black literature. So how will it speak differently to us? How will we engage differently with it? So I think there's this way in which how we do and act with digital technology means we need to be paying attention to the kinds of biases that feed in. And there are also religious biases that feed into the ways these kinds of AI are functioning. And we're in tandem training with it. And I think we need more folks across really diverse spectrums so that we can end up with AI that represents more of us.
Kate, if I could, you've raised something for me to consider because you always talk about bringing in the scriptures and how we're wrestling with that. And you've raised a thought for me here where you said about bringing in the presence, which I believe is extremely important. And then you raised about where two or three are gathered. What you have me wondering about in this moment now is how individuals, of course, are looking at and perceiving the AI because they see, or there are many who sometimes see AI as distinct individual personhood. So am I, when I'm engaging, is that two individuals, and how individuals will answer that and wrestle with that, and how they will sometimes say, well, I've met that, I'm in community, or I am in relationship. That's a wonderful point that we ought to consider and continue, or at least you have me, of course, more mindful of as you stated it.
Yeah, so this is so tricky theologically.
Yes,
right?
Very much so.
Yes.
And when we think about in Christian Ethics for a Digital Society, as we think about ourselves as networked individuals, I lean into our Trinitarian theology that God is three and one. More recently, I've been doing work thinking about how we imagine the body of Christ showing up digitally for us. So I think we are always ourselves, and we are always more than that. We are always part of community. So I don't have a hard and fast theological conclusion on like, does AI get to count as personhood? Because honestly, I think that's a distracting debate.
Yes.
And it distracts us because it continues to force us, from my point of view, into a very Western, Euro-American kind of system of individualism, as opposed to thinking, honestly, I don't care if it's a tree. Actually, I care deeply. If it's a tree, or if it's an avatar in VR, or if it's simply the AI that's running my phone. If I recognize all of those things in the framework of neighbor, then I know that I am being morally shaped when I engage them. And whether or not how I engage them shapes them or creates some form of level equitable personhood does not matter to me, because we are in fact being shaped by those engagements. And so if I can level up my moral accountability, I want to do that. So I am going to see the tree and the rabbit and the AI and the avatar as my neighbor, my chatbot, my Alexa, right? That is already programmed with gender bias to be this white sounding helper in the United States, female helper, right?
Yes.
How do I interact with that? And that might also lead us to starting to see the ways in which how we are embodied digital spirits that will push us even further away from that sort of Western dualism that Christianity's been struggling with for centuries.
Yes. As we were having a call with Kate a couple of months ago, you talked about we're not just bodies and spirits, we're digital, spiritual, and embodied. And it's this Trinitarian view of self. And you talked a little bit about this. How does this impact us as we navigate the digital space in a positive or a negative way? And AI fits into that for sure. But I love thinking about how we are digital selves and embodied in that space, bringing our spirituality. It's really beautiful.
Yeah. So for me, there are these traditions in thinking both theologically, but also about digital technologies, sort of a very Western individualist, transhumanist move of like, we will modify our bodies to become immortal. I'm not part of that camp. So I want to be really clear that I'm not part of that. But there's also this way that folks have been reconceiving both of transhumanism or also of posthumanism to help us say, like, yeah, our analog past is different than our current digital existence. And we have to recognize that it's different. And yet, maybe we have some clues from the ways in which we have already really operated across history as humans, thinking about our relationship to the divine, being created in the image of the divine. So, really breaking down the body spirit kind of dualism that exists and saying we are always embodied spirits. And we have always been technologists. One of my favorite theologians around digital technology is John Dyer. And his work really looks at the way in which throughout scripture, we have always been in relationship with God and using tools in that relationship, right?
Mm-hmm.
Building an ark, building the Tower of Babel. We don't always get it right. So we should definitely pay attention to those parts of scripture. But we've always been engaged in that kind of technology that allows us to communicate, that allows us to create community, right? It's not just about is the shovel separate from me? My colleague Kenneth Ngwa, who's a Cameroonian biblical scholar, has this beautiful imagery around how God's self appears to us both in the burning bush, in a rock where dreams are communicated, right? He's a Hebrew scripture specialist, so most of the examples come from there. But you think even about the ways in which Jesus used material reality to heal people, to share the images of who God is and can be for us, of Christ being both embodied, incarnate, but also living water. These are forms of technology. Our technologies are made up of those same kinds of molecules and dirt and minerals. So I just want us to use our theological imaginations to move beyond the stark divisions that we've created for those, because I think those stark divisions have often led to hierarchies and to very kinds of oppressive categorizations, right? We can do what we want with the earth. We can consider certain people less than other people. And what happens when we get rid of those divisions and actually see our similarities across them? I think that shows that we are digitally embodied spirits, but it also forces us to act anew in community with each other.
Kate, I appreciate what you have stated and the way that you've stated it, because the question is always there about our relationships with God and one another. And, what do these tools, if I can put it in that term, what kind of relationships do they foster? And what are the outcome? And your approach by asking the question, are we consistently and routinely asking the question, what does the relationship look like? What are the consequences? What is fostered from the kind of usage of these materials? Are they bringing us community? Even what community looks like, which is a current question. What does it mean to be in community is not what it used to be when we knew whoever lived on my street next door, who I might have met at church, in certain other spaces. But now that we have this digital space, what does that look like? And that's the question that we have to ask. But even with our imaginations, what are we imagining? And it's out of our imaginations that we sometimes are creating. And so to what end is all of this going to bring us? That's the wrestle. And I think as we continue to push each other, we would push each other, of course, to what I hope would be a very positive end.
Well, you all have both touched on aspects of this, but as we are wrapping up today, I would love to ask, where do you find hope in digital community, in life online, in our digital embodied spiritual selves?
That's a great question. Where I find hope is really through my relationships and conversations, even in the moment like this, where we're able to question and wrestle together. And we're even doing this, as we know, there's, of course, technology and pieces that are involved in this conversation that are helping us to do that. So we're already taking advantage of this. Being able to engage with someone and to have the information and to raise the information, it brings me hope, even in the midst of challenge. As I often say, that no matter how dark it gets, there's a bright side somewhere, that we're searching for it, we're looking for it. So I do find hope in that, and grateful for this conversation this morning.
Thank you, Leonard.
Yeah, I mean, I find hope in similar places to what Leonard has said. And for me, it's just always in the moment of the question. And I think our faith communities can be that place. And I really want our faith communities to understand that you don't have to have all the answers. In fact, that's exactly opposite of what people are looking for. People are looking for spaces where they can genuinely ask their questions. And I find hope in the fact that our traditions can bring meaning to how we will answer those questions, or how we keep seeking answers to those questions. So that's where I find hope. I find hope in the spaces where people both say, I don't think it has to be this way, or should it really be this way? And then there's a community that is available to them, or forums around them, that says, yeah, let's ask those questions. Let's think about new ways. So I really appreciate this podcast being one of those spaces that is encouraging that questioning, as well as creating the community around it.
Thank you. Well, Kate and Leonard, thank you both so much for joining us today to talk about living ethically as digital citizens. I could keep talking about this all day. Our next episode features an excerpt from a conversation between Dean Randy and author and theologian Jim Wallace around his new book, The False White Gospel. Thanks for listening to Crossroads, and until next time, peace be with you. If the digital offerings of the Cathedral enrich your daily life, please consider becoming a supporter today by making a gift at cathedral.org/inspire.